Hi all, welcome to the session on Spring Boot RESTful Services with ChatGPT. So here in this video, we will explore the concept of Spring Boot, discover various layers in Spring Boot RESTful Services, create an empty Spring Boot RESTful Services using Spring Initializr, demonstrate how a ChatGPT can assist in creating a Spring Boot RESTful services. We'll also see how one can take help from ChatGPT to test a RESTful services using JUnit 5. And finally, we will also look into use of Postman to test the RESTful endpoints. So let's begin this video by asking a very simple question. What is Spring Boot RESTful services? So again, instead of we answering it ourselves, let's use ChatGPT prompts to answer for our queries. So for that, let's move to ChatGPT now. This is a ChatGPT UI where I can provide my queries and ChatGPT provides the solution for whatever the query that we ask for. So as we already said, we'll be asking the very first question, what is Spring Boot? So for that, let me give out a prompt to the ChatGPT saying, explain, explain Spring Boot RESTful services for a if I want to learn a Spring Boot as a beginner. So first of all, I need to get to know what Spring Boot RESTful services is all about. Once we get the response, as we can go and read from the response from the ChatGPT that Spring Boot is a popular Java-based framework that makes it easy to create standalone production-ready Spring-based applications. So basically, it's basically saying the Spring Boot is a Spring-based application and it will be a production-ready. And it also gives an overview key concept behind Spring Boot RESTful services. The first is a RESTful architecture, and not only the overview, it also gives the explanation about why that overview for a Spring Boot RESTful services. The first is a RESTful architecture. The second is it's a Spring Boot provides a simple and powerful way to create a RESTful web services. The third is a controller layer, which it has the HTTP methods it can hold a data transfer format. So basically, these are the overview of a Spring Boot RESTful services that makes a Spring Boot a production ready Spring based applications. And also along with that, it also provides a summary of what Spring Boot is. And also it says overall Spring Boot makes it easy to build a RESTful services in Java, and it provides a powerful and flexible framework for building a scalable and robust web applications. So basically, this response from the ChatGPT is explaining a Spring Boot in basics for a beginner. So I can make it concise. This answer can be made concise by the ChatGPT just by a command called make the answer more concise. So as you can see in the response that is provided by the ChatGPT, so in the first response that was provided by the ChatGPT, it had a few definitions, few overviews as a point, and also the overall summary of the explanation. But when I said it to make it more concise, so it concised it to a one paragraph, defines the Spring Boot in a more simpler and concise manner. So now we know what Spring Boot is all about. Next thing is let's dive deep into some basic concepts of Spring Boot. For example, as we already saw, there will be different layers. So let's try to get to know about the various layers that we have in the Spring Boot RESTful services. So for that, let me give out a prompt saying what are the different layers in a Spring Boot RESTful services. So as a response, as you can see, the Spring Boot has three typical main layers: the presentation layer, the service layer, and the data access layer. And what each layer does, you will be able to read it from the explanation that is provided by the ChatGPT. And along with that, it also provides the overall summary of the explanation that is provided by the ChatGPT prompt. So these are the different layers that we use in Spring Boot. And along with that, we can ask for many other topics that we need to learn to become a Spring Boot developer. So for example, provide me or give me all the. Okay, so basically as the response, we can see that here are some of the topics that I need to go through as a beginner to be a proficient in a Spring Boot. So first of all, introduction to the Spring Boot. So basically, I need to understand some of the basics of the Spring Boot. Spring Boot setup, Spring Boot annotation, Spring Boot controller, Spring Boot services, Spring Boot data access, Spring Boot testing, Spring Boot security, Spring Boot deployment, and Spring Boot practices. So these are some of the basic topics that I need to go through to become a Spring Boot application developer. So it also gives a summary. By covering these topics, you will have a solid foundation in the Spring Boot development and be able to create a simple to complex web application using this framework. So now we know what Spring Boot is. Now we know what are the basic concepts that I need to go through to become a Spring Boot developer, and we also know what are the different layers that we have in a Spring Boot. Now let's try to use ChatGPT and get the help from the ChatGPT to create a simple Spring Boot RESTful services. For that, I'll just give it as a scenario based, saying that Act has a Spring Boot programmer create us create a RESTful service. Different layers of Spring Boot, saying controller layer, service layer, and repository layer. CRUD operation. So CRUD is basically create, retrieve, update, and delete. CRUD operation. So let's use a simple in-memory database such as H2 database to perform CRUD operation on H2 database. So basically, in this query, I'm actually saying to ChatGPT to create to act as a Spring Boot programmer to create a RESTful services with all different layers that is provided, that is controller, service, and repository layer, to perform a CRUD operation on an in-memory database called H2 database, and the ChatGPT has to use a product entity for creating one. So I'll just click on enter and wait for ChatGPT to provide me the with the solution. So the response has been generated, and there are 6 steps to begin with. So let us go to the very first step. So the first step, it says you need to set up a new Spring Boot project with the following dependencies: Spring Web, Spring Data JPI, and H2 database. So how to set up a new project? So again, let us ask the ChatGPT itself to create a new Spring project for us. So for that, let me go to the prompt and say new Spring Boot project using Spring Initializer. Okay, the response has been created by the ChatGPT, and it has many other steps along with it. So the very first step is to go to the Spring Initializer website. So this is the Spring Initializer where I can create a new Spring Boot application. The second step, it says configure the project by selecting the choices. Like for example, my own project, Java, Spring Boot, group, artifact ID, packaging, and Java. So let's go to Spring Initializer and select the one which is required. So I'll just select it as Maven, language as Java, Spring Boot as 2711, and the group ID has com.stackroot, and the artifact has something called ChatGPT. I can name the artifact ID as anything that I want, and the name of the application to be anything that I want. Packaging as jar and Java to the version of 11. So if you have the Java 17 JDK version 17 installed in the system, you can select 17 also. And along with that, I need to add some more dependencies. So let's go to Spring Boot ChatGPT and ask what are the dependencies that is required. For that, let us go to the previous response that is provided by the ChatGPT, where you will be able to see the dependencies which need to be added. So the first dependency is the Spring Web, second dependency is the Spring Data JPA, and third is H2 database. So let me go and add a dependency called Web, Spring Web, add a dependency. Second is the H2 database, and the third dependency is nothing but a JPA. So we have all the three dependencies created, and I can click on generate. So this will generate a zip folder for us, and it will be downloaded here. So I can extract it here to extract the entire application. So I can click on this extract and it will create this, and I can open this with my favorite IntelliJ community editions. So the application will be open in IntelliJ as shown in the window. So here you will be able to see the basic boilerplate that has been created by the Spring initializers. So this is the main class, and we can go to the pom.xml where I'll be able to see the dependency that has been added. So JPA, web, and H2 dependencies. Along with that, it also has a test dependencies which will be by default dependency for a Spring Boot application. Okay, so now we have created a empty Spring Boot application using Spring Initializr. The next thing is to create a product entity class with the following attribute. So this ChatGPT is asking us to create a product entity class. So let me go to the application that we have just created. Let me create a new class named product. So this is the class name called product where it has the product entity class. So let me copy the code from here and paste it out. So there are few errors. So let me use the IntelliJ itself to import the classes. Just hover over it and you'll get the option to import the class. So it asks to create annotation, but we can just remove this, I guess. Import the class, and so big decimal, import the class. So again, it also says to create a constructor, getter, and the setter. But instead of we creating on ourselves, let's use the ChatGPT itself to create a constructor, getter, and setter. So for that, let me go to the ChatGPT again, give it a prompt saying create a getter. Okay, so basically a constructor, getter, and setter for product entity. Okay, as a response, as you can see, it didn't only created the constructor, getter, and the setter. Again, it already created the product entity again. So let me use the entire code, copy the code, go to the code again, and just replace it with the new code. So now you will be able to see the IDs, name, price. Along with that, you will also be able to see the empty constructor, parameterized constructor, getter, and setter for each of the parameter. So let us go to the very first response that we got to create a new Spring Boot application. So we are done with the first step that need to create a Spring Boot application. We have done it. Second, we created a product entity class along with the getter and the setter and the constructor. And the next thing is to create a product repository layer interface that extends the JPA repository to define the CRUD operations. So for that, let me go to the code again and create a new class named product repository and copy the code and paste it. Again, there is some error here because of the class not getting imported. So I can import it on my own by just hovering over it, import class, hover over the application and import class. So we are done with importing all the classes, required classes, and we are done with creating a repository layer also. The next step is to create a product service class that implements the business logic for the product entity. So it says to create a product service class. So let me copy the code, go back to the code, create a new class named product service and paste the whole thing out. So again, there are some error here because of a class not getting imported defaultly. So I can hover over it and try to import it. So all the errors has been resolved. So now we are done with the service class also, or the service layer. The next step is to create a product controller class to handle the HTTP request, and this is the product controller. Again, it asks me to create a new class called product controller. So I can just copy this, go back to the code, create a new class named product controller, and I can paste it out. All the error has been resolved. Basically, all the classes which is required for the controller layer has been imported. Now we are done with all the repository layers, service layers, and the controller layers. Along with that, we have also created a model class for product entity. The next step is to run the application and make request to the following endpoints to perform CRUD operation on the product entity. So let's try to run the application. So for that, let me go to the main class and run the application here. So now you will be able to see application has been started and a Tomcat server has been started on the port number 8080. And at last, it's also said that's it. You have a fully functional RESTful services with controller, service, and repository to perform CRUD operation on an H2 database with a product entity. So how to test the endpoints? So basically, it just gives the command on how to test it, but we don't know is there any application which can be used to test it. So let's try to give a command or a prompt to the ChatGPT on how to test. So for example, let me give a prompt saying how can I test the RESTful service? Okay, once we get the response, so the prompt was how to test the RESTful services. So basically, the ChatGPT is saying you can test the RESTful services using a web client such as Postman or writing a test unit test using a testing framework such as JUnit. Here's an example on how to test a RESTful service using JUnit. So basically, it is giving an example on how to test the endpoints using the JUnit framework. But it also says we can also test it by using a web client called as a Postman. So let's try to use this first, where we can test the endpoints using the Postman. So I'll just give a prompt saying how to test REST endpoints using Postman. Okay, once the response has been generated, you can go and just see testing REST endpoints using Postman is relatively simple. So there are few basic steps that we need to follow to test the endpoints using the Postman. The first thing is to install the Postman. If you haven't already installed, please install the Postman, or you can use the Chrome extension Postman web from the Postman website. So I have already installed the Postman into my system where I can test the REST endpoints. So once my application is running on the port number 8080, I can test the endpoints through the post. Now, if you go to the controller layer where all the endpoints will be exposed, you can see the request mapping as API/products. And you can also see there are few get mappings, the post mappings, the put mappings, and delete mappings. So let's try to test one after the other endpoints. So the first is API/products. So for that, to test that endpoints, let's go to the Postman and just say HTTPS /localhost 8080 because my local my application is running on the port number 8080. So that's the reason I'm giving it as a 8080 slash API slash the endpoints that has been provided API slash products. So I'll just copy this and paste it here. So the first endpoints is a get mapping. So I'll just take it as a get mapping and click on send. Okay, there is no response as of now because there is no data which is residing in H2 database. So let's do the post mapping first, where I'll be sending some data or saving some data into my H2 database, and then I'll be making some get request. So for that, let me make a post request for now. So I'll just say it as a post request, and in the body, I can provide all the details. So I can go to body, raw, I can choose as a JSON server, and I can provide my details like the product details here. So what are the details that I need to send? So I need to send an ID, which will be a generated value. I need to send a name, a price, and a quantity. So let's try to send all this data. So I'll just send it as a name. Name will be something called alpha. Then I'll be sending a price. So I'll make the price of the alpha to be 230. And at last, I need to send the quantity. So let me send the quantity as 20. So it's a post mapping. I can send it. So now you will be able to see that it is a 200 OK status with the data here. The ID has been self-generated. Now, once the data is residing in the H2 database, I can call any other endpoints such as get endpoints. So for that, let me go and check for the get endpoints and click on send. So through the get mapping, I'll be able to see the data which is residing in the H2 database. As it already says, there is another endpoint where I can get the data based on its ID. So as a path variable, I can send its ID value and I can get the data of that particular product which has a ID has one. Along with that, I can test other endpoints has similar, the put mapping and delete mapping. So now we have tested our endpoints using the postman with all the endpoints that has been exposed through the controller layer. So that's all about the session, where in this session we learned about what is Spring Boot, some basic concepts of the Spring Boot that we need to learn to become a Spring Boot developer. And we also saw what are the different layers in the Spring Boot application. And we also tried to create a simple Spring Boot application and created a new application using a Spring Initializr and used the ChatGPT to provide us the code for a simple Spring Boot application. And at last, we also saw how to test the endpoints using the Postman. So that's for the session. Thank you.